Welcome to Page Views Live. Thank you for coming and spending your lunch hour, if you're on the East Coast, with Page Views Live, our Film Quarterly Book Club. I'm Rebecca Prime. I'm the editor of Film Quarterly and want to welcome you to our Page Views Live webinar, which we do every issue as a way to extend the conversation around the exciting new publication that we have spotlighted in the journal in our Page Views Live feature. And Page Views is masterfully edited by Bruno Guaraná, who is appropriately master lecturer in, a master lecturer of film studies in the Department of Film and Television at Boston University. So thank you, Bruno, who has a remarkable capacity to have these incredibly insightful interviews across a wide range of subjects with our Page Views feature. So I'm always impressed by that. And Bruno is joined today by Kartik Nair, who is Assistant Professor of Film and Media Arts at Temple University. And as I was doing a little prep for today, I was reminded that this is, in fact, it's not Kartik's first rodeo. He has been both on a previous Film Quarterly webinar back in 2021, I think it was, when we did a webinar on reconsidering binge watching in the age of COVID-19. And that was an extension of a special dossier that we had in the fall issue of Film Quarterly on binge watching. So, which it remains one of our most popular topics. So, I think Kartik, your contribution to that was on Friends, if I recall, the one with all the Netflix binging Friends at work, which I always think of because I know it was in the news recently. So there was the settlement of that case. So it's great to have Kartik back live on a webinar, but he is also, it's very appropriate that Kartik is here because back in 2019, he was the guest editor of Page Views, contributing two really great pieces. I think one was on Priya Jayakumar's book, Where Histories Reside, India's Film Space, and then another on Daniel Steinhardt's Runaway Hollywood, Internationalizing Post-War Production and Location Shooting. And if I recall correctly, at the time, you decided not to continue with Page Views because you needed to have more time to work on your book. And you put that time to good work because we are here today to discuss the fruits of your labor, which just came out with University of California Press in February of this year and has the for me, very evocative title of Seeing Things, Spectral Materialities of Bombay Horror. And the book brings a very welcome spotlight to, there we go. It's great. And I have to say, the illustrations are great throughout the book. It's, worth looking through just for all the fantastic art that accompanies it. So the book brings a welcome spotlight to the forgotten horror films that India produced from the 1970s to the 1990s. And I will let Bruno tell you in more detail about the really interesting approach that Kartik takes to unearthing this forgotten history. So thank you so much. Oh, and one thing I said I wasn't going to forget this time, and I almost did again. I want to mention that today's webinar is recorded and will be up on our website in about a week from now, and is there along with all our other webinars, Page Views, and other events that we do. So please check that out. It's a great teaching resource. Students love them, I hear. So take a look out for that. We'll have another Page Views Live coming up probably in June for our summer issue. And that's going to be with Marina Hasapopoulou about her new book, Interactive Cinema. Okay, without further ado, over to you, Bruno.
Thanks, Rebecca. These are great coincidences to point out. And I'm delighted to have Kartik here with us today. I have nothing to do with it, but I've been accompanying this project for a long time. And it's been really a huge pleasure to be able to read it so closely and to have conversations with Kartik about the book, culminating in this event today. So thank you for being here and for sharing your work. I'll say a few words about the book, and I'll preface it by saying that I'm not going to do justice to its breadth and its density, as well as the really exciting prose that Kartik is able to put together in telling the history of Bombay horror. So bear with me as I go through a few things that I wanted to highlight before I have a proper conversation about it. So Seeing Things, this book here that I have in my hand by Yusuf Press, traces the history of production, circulation, and regulation of B horror films made in Bombay between the late 70s and early 1990s. Independently produced in an era rife with crises for the Indian film industry and presenting an aesthetic that betrayed their cheap mode of production, these films were largely berated by contemporaneous film critics and, for the most part, ignored by media scholars and traditional film historiography. Yet niche audiences receive these films with open arms, and so does Kartik, whose close readings of Bombay horror films show a deep appreciation for them and a wide and passionate interest in the horror genre more broadly. But these films, very importantly, don't make up perfect objects of analyses. To the contrary, for Kartik, it is in their many failures that they provide avenues for a historiographic practice of investigation that ultimately reveals a thorough and intricate history of production, circulation, and regulation. The book persuasively invites us to look at these films not despite, but for their failures, for what they represent, and for what they index. And it is these failures that lead Kartik into different archives and haunted mansions to interview filmmakers, performers, and crew members of the Bombay horror cycle. And as his research methods fail to tell the whole story, visits to archives, as well as interviews with filmmakers and crew members, Kartik would return to watch these films over and over again in different formats and different copies, thinking that, in each new iteration of the experience of watching the film and of the new copy, there might be a new trace to be investigated. What Kartik looks for, it turns out, are those moments of interruption of the aesthetic experience, visible traces of labor on screen, the labor of filmmakers, of actors, censors, archivists, and even web users who upload copies of films to streaming platforms. A brief enumeration of how the chapters add up to this story, I think, showcases the breadth of his work. So I'll say a few things that appear throughout the chapters. A censor certificate revealing the discourses of state censors as they targeted what they call scenes of horror. Film prints as forensic material tracing the labor of censorship. Mise-en-scène and production design as symptomatic of the multiple crises troubling the Indian film industry in the 80s. And film and video damage, such as scratches and noise that point to exhibition, archival, and transfer practices, as well as a newfound retroactive interest in this otherwise obscure period in Indian film production. Each of these chapters focuses on a different horror film from the period, but it's clear to me that the films and methods might be interchangeable with one another. Beyond the historical specificity of its object, the book offers a really useful range of historical research methods, aided by a deeply effective textual analysis. But it is also, I should say, full of pleasures in historical anecdotes in its style. Reading it, I found myself alternately widening my eyes and grinning from ear to ear as Kartik would peel yet another layer of meaning from beneath these scenes of horror. And the other layer of pleasure to me was to be able to hear such a familiar voice coming across in textual form, right? And I've had the opportunity of watching some of these films with students as Kartik guest spoke, I guess, in one of my classes before and in other events as well. So, this is a momentous occasion, I think. So, Kartik, congratulations on the book, and thank you for coming and speaking with us about Seeing Things. I wanted to, I guess, give you a chance to correct anything that I might have forgotten or misspoken about. But also, I guess I'll start with this question that in the book, in the introduction of the book, you state that it began as a project to understand how the horror films of 1980s Bombay were made and seen. And I wanted to ask you something that I think you've been wanting to respond, which is why horror, right? And so what initially drew you to these films in particular, and how have they been so central to your research really and your work as a scholar?
Um, Thanks, Bruno. Thank you for that question. Before I begin, I just want to thank Annie, Mark, everybody at Film Quarterly for organizing this event and these series of events that have been so important for those of us who seek other avenues to engage with new work. And I'm really appreciative for this invitation. Thanks to Rebecca, who's actually been a kind of a frequent mentor of mine. The early work that I did for Film Quarterly was under her guidance. And it was really with working with her that I understood so much about, and Ruby, about how books get read and should be read. And that was really valuable as I was working on the book. And that's why, indeed, I had to step away when I did. And I'm grateful to come back now as the book is complete. And of course, I cannot begin without acknowledging that it's very meaningful to be in conversation with Bruno. Bruno and I have known each other now for a very long time. We started in the same year at NYU in the Department of Cinema Studies as PhD students. And so that familiar voice that Bruno hears in the book is the familiarity of now almost 15 years of having known each other. And so this is a very special moment, a kind of homecoming in many ways, to be in conversation both with Rebecca and Bruno, as well as everybody behind the scenes and who's attending today. So the question was about this kind of fascination with horror. Why horror, right, Bruno? That's the question.
Yes, yes.
Every horror film scholar gets this question. Well, why do you work on horror films? I have found in the process of completing the book, rather than when I was writing it, an invitation to reflect on what horror films have meant to me. And horror films were my entry not only into the world of serious cinephilia, but into the world of film studies. And by that, I mean in the late 90s, when I was a teenager, my first real cinematic experiences were watching contemporary American slasher films. I think, Bruno, you and I have talked about this a bit, but Scream was a definitive moment, not only in my film education, but in my life. I'd never seen anything like it. And I remember being so entranced by the film, obsessively rewatching it. And this was growing up in Delhi in India. And wanting to understand more about this strange kind of film that is both attempting to scare you, right? But also wanting to talk about why it's scary, right? It's a kind of reflexive horror film. And what I found the film encodes is a popular version of film study. And a quick internet search in that time led me to discovering Carol Clover's essay on the slasher film. And so that was an aha moment for me, where I found that there was somebody out there that, for a living, it seemed, in a professionally legitimate setting, was writing about this film that had really moved me, or this genre of film that had really moved me. And so, in a way, my love for film studies are inextricable from my love for horror. To me, it's this weird thing where your paradigmatic or primal scene is connected to a low genre, right? And you never quite recover from it. Every other film genre then feels like some imitation version of this initial encounter. And so my formation, I would say, as a film scholar, was through horror film studies. And that's not a coincidence. I mean, horror film studies has become the most prolific, fertile subfield of genre film studies. One of the most active scholarly interest groups at SCMS is the horror film SIG. I have friends in that subfield. And so I see myself very much as part of a conversation. And being in conversation is another one of the attractions of working on horror films. It's a very social genre, and that sociality is intellectual, academic, as much as it is popular and cinephilic. And so for me, given that formation, once I figured out through Carol Clover's reading of slasher films that film studies could be a thing, I knew that the work that I would do would be on horror. And so that's how the project initially took root and became a dissertation project at NYU as well.
Yeah, yeah. And how did you make the leap from horror more broadly to the Ramsey brothers? How central are they to your work and to the book? Or who are they? I guess we should start there.
Yeah. So the Ramsey brothers are a very well-known family name in India. And so I'm very cautious when I say that the films are forgotten. They are not forgotten. Everybody in India seems to have a sense of who the Ramsay brothers were and the kind of films they were making, even if they've never seen those, right? Because a lot of the attraction of this family name was the taboo association with a certain genre of low budget horror that kind of ruled the B-movie box office from the late 1970s to the early 1990s at least. And that's the cycle of films that I call Bombay horror, primarily associated with the 7 siblings known as the Ramsay brothers, working out of Bombay, but also some of their contemporaries, Mohan Bhakri, Vinod Talwar. This is a cycle of films that often features some of the same thematic, narrative, stylistic preoccupations. They'll often begin in Bombay, the city now known as Mumbai, but then move out of the city as the members of an aristocratic, often feudal family have to do battle with some kind of monstrous force that is connected to some sin in the family's past. That monstrous force, whether it is a vampire of some kind or a churel of some kind, also provides the film's major attraction, and on the strength of which the films were sold as horror films in the market. And the chance to kind of encounter that monstrous force also provided the sensational lore of what we call horror for audiences, right? So these are horror films by their own definition, as well as by some of the kind of semantic elements that we associate with the genre. When I began working on the project first at JNU in Delhi, very little academic work had been done on these brothers. And I found it very interesting that these were films that flourished in the decade of horror that I otherwise knew very well through American horror film, right? From the late 70s, so thinking of everything like Halloween, Alien, The Shining, through the 80s, all the Wes Craven films, all the Friday the 13th films, to the early 1990s. This is a period that tracks with a very familiar genre form that I knew. There were these other films that were happening much closer to me that I had no clue about. And so it was this kind of draw towards, once again, the taboo or the unknown that propelled me to start working on it.
I find something, I was rereading your introduction, and there was something that stood out to me, that was apparent, but not as pointed. And you clearly write this early on, that these B-horror films were not invested in a folk aesthetic. Right? That in fact, they're also very much influenced by this global horror cycle. And so that's part of the critique that they receive from critics, that they are cheap copies of films that are already circulating globally, right?
Yes. Sorry, go ahead. No, go ahead.
No.
No, actually, thanks for bringing that up. In an earlier version of the book's introduction that no longer exists in print, I began the book by discussing a moment in Veerana, which is a film I know you're familiar with. This is a film called Veerana from 1988, directed by Shyam and Tulsi Ramsay, in which the churel, or the kind of demonic revenant figure, stalks a man in an abandoned sawmill at night. And one of the kind of fascinating glitches that appears in that sequence are these very seemingly low resolution shots of 3 dogs barking. Right. And I became completely mesmerized by why these dogs were barking and why we couldn't quite see them clearly. And it took me a while to understand that these were interpolations from a copy of John Carpenter's The Thing. Right. And these were the huskies that you will recognize, if you're familiar with The Thing, as barking in the kind of ice-packed research station at the start of the film, as an alien kind of infests the scene. And so these were filmmakers like the Ramsays, very audacious cinephiles, completely invested in participating in a kind of global circuit of what we might call horror, and not quite interested in confining themselves to some notion of what Indian horror might be. Right? They had very canny notions of how to Indianize horror, but not so committed in producing kind of folk form, shall we say.
Yeah, in the same time, right, for I guess a Western audience or someone unfamiliar with Indian cinema, the films do look distinct, right? Even though they're not really pushing, they're still embracing some, I guess, popular forms present in Indian cinema at the time.
Yes. And they are masala films. They are films that follow kind of a menu-driven logic of attractions in which horror abuts comedy, song and dance, romance, action. And they offer a different definition of what horror is and how horror emerges in the spectatorial experience, which is that horror emerges from juxtaposition with other affect, right? At the same time, one of the things that's fascinating about them is how they use the conventions of slasher or satanic horror films to interrupt Bombay cinema's kind of conventions of song and dance, marriage, family. So you'll get a werewolf interrupting a wedding procession, or you'll get a serial killer cutting off a song, right? And so very canny combinations of what we might call the globally circulating signs of horror, as well as the well-known idioms of Bombay cinema.
And just hearing you say these things like answers the first question of why horror. Clearly horror is engaged in cinephilia, right? In quotations, as well as inviting the viewer to think through these other texts as well, right? So it's not surprise, even though it's a question that horror scholars will get a lot. I wanted to talk a little bit, because you mentioned this about the historical context of Bombay cinema in the 70s, 80s that allows the appearance of independent B horror films.
So this is not my work. Valentina Vitali, in her work on kind of independent film production in multiple contexts, has made the argument that low-budget genre films emerge in Bombay in the late 70s and early 80s because large troves of undeclared, or what shall we call black money, needed channels in which to circulate quickly. And so the quickly produced film, or the cheaply produced film, provided a vehicle to circulate this money quickly through channels, right? And to turn the money white. Now that is a kind of political economic explanation for why multiple genres are birthed in this moment, among them horror, right? Mehli Sen has a very interesting, shall we say, complementary answer that explains not why so much the films were being made, but maybe why they stuck with audiences, which is that they are symbolic forms for the addressal of trauma suffered by Indians at large during the 70s, the moment of what is now known as the emergency and its aftershocks, right? And so that's a kind of cultural, maybe psychoanalytic explanation for why horror sticks, right? Valentina is offering a kind of political economic explanation for why horror emerges. And I found that I was very grateful that these accounts emerged as I was writing the dissertation, because I didn't feel equipped to provide any of these answers. And my focus could shift from why horror to how horror, right? So yes, money has to circulate, but how does that money take form in the kind of materiality of the medium of filmmaking at this moment? What aspects of the production design can we discern how capital is distributed in? And rather than having to answer why audiences might have been drawn to these films, which is probably the most important question in some ways, I could answer the question, how are audiences encountering these films? And how was the mode of that encounter then shaping how they were experiencing the films?
And speaking of shaping, I think a lot of your book focuses on censoring practices. And you make an interesting claim that I really like, that censors become filmmakers in their own right? And sort of imposing these limitations or forcing scenes to be rewritten or simply cut. They are also, right, rewriting the films as they go. So tell us how you found that the state has influenced these films in particular, but also the genre as a whole. Sure.
So I am situated within a longer tradition of folks who are thinking quite provocatively about censorship, not only as repression, but as production, right? And we can think of Monica Mehta's work, we can think of William Mazzarella's work, Lotte Hook's work on censorship in the context of Bangladeshi cinema, where Lotte makes the argument that censors are effectively filmmakers too, right? Because they are often actively present in the filmmaker's imagination as the filmmaker's making the film, but also because they control the public life of the film once the film has been made. I was writing in a context of state-regulated popular film, which meant that this is especially before the era of video, it was very hard to see a film in a theater that had not already been authorized, pre-screened, pre-cleared by members working with the censor board, which was a kind of state-mandated authority in India, right? So no film could be released technically without a censor certificate clearing the film for release. And within that context, it's easy to imagine the state's power as asymmetric, right? Because these are low budget films, and without the censors, okay, these films could not be released. And indeed, that was the way in which that power was often exercised by the state's refusal to clear a film, right? But that refusal was often an opening move in a longer negotiation, right, of how to modify or make a film acceptable for release. And that's where things get very interesting, because, of course, horror is a genre that wants to be unacceptable, right? And so here you have this tension between a genre that's striving to be as provocative, as transgressive, and on the other hand, you have a body whose main mission is to make the film as acceptable, as palatable as possible. And I wanted to track that encounter. And tracking that encounter via through paperwork or through film prints allowed me to see that the censors were remaking films, whether they were ordering filmmakers to remove certain images, right? And that is a form of kind of remaking a film, but also through forceful kind of interventions into finished film, right? One of the chapters, chapter 2, looks at the censor's management of the film Jani Dushman from 1979. And I make the argument that the censor's kind of forceful regulation of offending images of werewolves' violence against young brides manifests in damage to the film's print, right? And whether that is because these interventions were carried out hurriedly within the internegative, interpositive, I'm unsure when that happened, but we can see how whenever the monster is about to strike, a whole series of kind of cues of visual damage and noise also erupt into the film. And so in a way, the censors ended up purging Jani Dushman of problematic images, but also producing new kinds of psychedelic gore, shall we say, right? It's a kind of gore of the insides of the film strip now aspirating visually. And that I found very interesting to work with, and eventually ended up theorizing along the lines of thinking of what the censor was doing to the finished film as something like experimental filmmaking or abstract filmmaking, right? This cameraless modes of filmmaking where you work directly onto the film strip to kind of leave your mark, right? And the argument I make there is that by leaving their kind of weird marks within the world of the horror film, the censors were maybe fomenting a kind of paranoid spectator who is always looking, observing the traces of a presence in the film that they can sense but not see, like that somebody is here looking at them, but they can't quite see who it is, but just beyond the veil of the damage of the film print, they can sense somebody else watching them watching the film, right? And so it becomes a kind of another kind of horror film as you experience the shadow of the censor.
If I can just interject for a second. I mean, that's so fascinating, that idea of the film strip being haunted really by the censor. But I'm just thinking about censorship, of course, compared to what we know about, the production code. And it made me curious, were these censors acting according to a prescribed set of criteria, or was it sort of subjective? Like, what sort of guidance did they have in their censorship?
I would say both. So chapter 1 of the book, which is focused on Darwaza or Door from 1978, the first horror film of this cycle, looks at how the film's emergence may have prompted a change in the censor's published code of censorship, right? So a new category of offending image was added to the code called scenes of horror, right? And I speculate in that chapter about what scenes of horror might mean by looking at what was ordered removed from the right. So it's a kind of open-ended exploration of how a discursive category may have emerged from the subjective experience of censors looking at a film. But censorship is such an interesting job. It's a kind of emotional labor where the censor is projecting into the future some kind of imagined offense and feeling on behalf of others, right? And so to me, what was interesting was that the incisions in the kind of negative that I can sense or see are subjectively felt incisions. They're moments of excitement. They're moments of arousal. They're moments of distress, potentially, rather than what often emerges in other ethnographies of censorship, which is how much distraction, boredom, and inattention censors bring to film viewing, right? Because of the kind of industrial scale of how many films they're watching. Here you have moments of kind of heightened scrutiny, right? And also my own affective investment in reading those incisions is probably adding some charge to them as well. That kind of is mirroring a previous historical encounter that I can now only read as the sliver in the strip.
Right.
And of course, I think
handing
the
it back to you.
prescription.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
I just want to mention to our audience that we are going to be open for questions. We're going to spend about the last 15, 20 minutes of this webinar with your questions. So feel free to start adding them to the Q&A now, and we'll get to them in order. So sorry, Bruno, please go ahead.
No, I just wanted to add that the very term scenes of horror seems to accommodate affect, right? So that it doesn't have to be something that's present on screen, but something that's felt by the sensor or projected that audiences will feel. I forget what I was going to say. But you were talking about this idea that censorship is inscribing something on the film. To me, is parallel to the fact that censorship is also strictly documented, right? And made public, not just the fact of censorship, but also descriptions of scenes that were excised from the films, which became also part of your archival research, right? Looking at censor scripts, but also publication in, is it Gazette of India?
Yes.
Right, indicating which scenes had been removed. I'm wondering, did films also, these films in particular, also bank on the fact that they were heavily censored to sort of suggest, look at us, we are transgressive and we have this edge?
Yeah. I mean, the drawn out censorship saga of a film like Jani Dushman was widely reported on not only trade papers in Bombay, but newspapers like the Times of India. And so there's no way to disentangle that kind of pre-release history from the charge that audiences bring to the film on the day of viewing. And we have letters from film fans writing into film magazines saying, this film was almost banned, I don't see why, it's not that great. Like, so there's this weird way in which they feel disappointed almost by the finished film's promise of taboo. And then the other thing, because you mentioned the Gazette of India, is the Gazette of India is a kind of publication that documents all the work done by different kinds of government offices. And they have these long appendices in some issues, which detail all decisions taken by the different censor boards in India, the office of the different censor boards in India, as they go through films and mandate deletions or modification. And my first encounter, for example, with Jani Dushman was watching the film and feeling or sensing like something had gone missing, not knowing what. Then I found the deletions listed in the Gazette of India, right? And so I had these verbal descriptions of images that were removed. But what I could not get my hands on, and we can maybe talk here about a broader kind of sense of failure within the project, are the actual missing bits of film, the bits of film that were removed. Now, these bits of film should be stored at the censor board for a period of years after they're removed. They should be sometimes with distributors and exhibitors. They should be with the film's producer. I, from all my effort, could not get my hands on this kind of untouched film. I only had access to the finished film, i.e. the film finished after censorship. And so that's why the film becomes my primary archive in so many ways, right? Because the film becomes the place where the secret work of censorship gets publicly circulated as trace, as sensory information, as evidence, right? And so that's maybe one of the ways in which the book's kind of central premise of seeing things in film as a methodological strategy also works or arises from.
A return to the text, right? When the archive fails.
Yeah.
The other thing that I find really interesting is that the book actually starts with regulation, right? I think normally one would expect regulation to be in the final chapters of the book. But I think you do this because it implies a causation between what the sensors are doing and what the genre becomes, both in terms of its aesthetics and affect, as well as modes of production and labor, right? So how is the genre reshaped by this idea of scenes of horror being targeted by censors, and what kinds of horrors were then made acceptable with these changes?
I just finished writing something for Mubi on Dick Smith and his blood recipe. And this blood recipe, or how to generate fake blood on screen, was very influential after the success of The Exorcist and other films that Smith had worked on. And the reason it's relevant is that in their 1978 film, Darwaza, the Ramsey brothers faced a lot of opposition from the censor board over a series of kind of climactic images in which a man's face bleeds into that of a monster, right? And so you can kind of see the facial deterioration as lots of blood spurts out from his face as it becomes that of a monster's face. And the censor board had a huge problem with these images and asked that the images of blood be removed. Cut to 1984's Purana Mandir. And what I find really interesting about this Ramsey Brothers film from not that many years later is that there's a lot of blood in the film, but the blood is rerouted. It's not flowing out of somebody's injured body, but it's coming out of a shower faucet as somebody is showering. And so by divorcing blood from graphic bodily injury, the film is able to hold on to something that we associate with the mise-en-scène of horror, right? Which is the blood as an index of pain, but blood also as red, as a kind of color that guarantees horror. And suggested the innovative kind of production strategies through which the mise-en-scène starts to carry the burden of producing horror in ways that graphic depictions of violence could no longer because of the censor's regulation. And so chapters 3 and 4 shift the attention from chapters 1 and 2. Chapters 1 and 2 are about censorship. Chapters 3 and 4 are about production and mise-en-scène. And so in chapter 3, I look at atmospheric locations, including background extras, filming locations, and things like that, props that seem to go rogue. And chapter 4 is about prosthetic makeup effects as kind of vehicles for producing horror. And so the argument I'm making there in that ordering of chapters is that as a way to manage the censor's dislike, let's say, of graphic depictions of violence, producers shifted their strategies towards producing horror through other elements that we might call atmospheric rather than graphic.
So that the horror became more, I guess, monstrous and even supernatural than it did on the flesh, right? And then one of the most fascinating things is your attention to detail in the crafting of makeup, prosthetic makeup, for example. So tell us a little bit about how much did the genre rely on this kind of labor, and then how some of this is produced, including, the now famous to me anecdote of the mask that gets stuck on someone's face.
Yeah, so it's an anecdote that I recount towards the end of chapter 4 from a hairdresser who worked on the film Virana, right? And Virana is a very good example of the kinds of special makeup work, right? And we understand special makeup to be a category that actually originated with Dick Smith and then traveled globally to designate these forms of kind of makeup work that work to transform the human body, amputate it, modify it, elevate it, injure it, right? Using effects materials. And my focus in that chapter is on the use of latex and rubber effects to produce monstrous bodies on screen. And I rely a lot in that chapter on my interviews with special makeup artists who worked with the Ramsey brothers and their contemporaries. And that's, to me, when I was doing it, I wasn't aware of it, but I've since become aware that that's a major recuperative project, in the sense that if you look at Hollywood in the 80s, we have an immense trove of interviews with Dick Smith's proteges, right? all the people, Rob Bottin, Chris Wallace, all the people who worked on the major horror films of that period, The Fly, for example, and are extensively cataloged and profiled in magazines like Fangoria, really celebrated marquee names. And what was interesting to me was that in Bombay, we have a similar generation of makeup artists who are producing the bodies that will circulate amongst millions of moviegoers and be remembered as kind of what moved them about these films. And we had no sense of what their work was or how they learned to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I combined my interviews with them about their process with a kind of close analysis of the films over time to see how the craft of prosthetic effects work evolves. And by the time we get to Virana, we're looking at the production of a churel on screen through the use of a three-piece latex mask that allows for a lot of facial articulation. And it's a very grisly mask. It even has a kind of beautiful cleave in the nose that produces a kind of density in the visual surface of the image that I read for a kind of body horror. And what's interesting to me, if I have a couple of minutes to explain this, is that many of us might know Linda Williams's essay on body genres, right? And where she makes the argument that, like pornography and comedy, horror is a body genre because it produces bodily reactions in the audience, often that mimic those of depicted bodies on screen. What I realized while writing that chapter is that Williams's essay comes out in 1991 in Film Quarterly, right? Mm-hmm. Why is this? What is it telling us that at the end of the 80s, she's producing this analysis of body horror? And so I work with that idea to then suggest that there's something of the body of the makeup artist also implicated in the makeup effect, right? And one can feel multiple bodies inscribed in the figure of the churel. For example, not only the body of the actress who's playing the churel and under the mask of which she's laboring, but the work of the makeup artist, the work of the hairdresser, right? And a kind of uncertainty in different points about who is behind the mask, because I have different stories about who played the churel, right?
And Kartik, just to interrupt, can you explain for the audience what sort of figure the churel is?
Sure. So a churel is a demonic revenant associated in South Asia with painful childbirth, some kind of unfinished business that causes them to return and seek justice for that trauma. And a popular figure in many kinds of storytelling traditions, but a very visible version of her is available in Virana, the 1988 Ramsey Brothers film. And so it's all. So for me, what became interesting about thinking with body horror, the churel, and makeup work was a kind of expanded notion of a conceptual category we have in horror, right? Which is, how do we relate to bodies on screen? We relate because something about the depiction of the body's transformation is transforming our body as we're watching the film. And I wanted to kind of thicken that understanding by saying, the bodies on screen are also being transformed by the labor of multiple bodies who are congealing in a kind of mode that is perceptible to us without being fully legible. And so much of the mystery of the churel, who is she, what does she want, is here compounded by my inability to read clearly the image and the kind of glitches or seams of the churel's latex mask that I then begin to read as traces of the labor of these makeup artists. And so just to finish, the anecdote that Bruno mentioned of the hairdresser is of somebody who's a woman working on a primarily male set. She and the actress playing the churel would have been probably two of the only women on that set. It was a nighttime set, and they were filming a kind of sequence from Virana in Bombay. And she remembers not so much the mastery of the craft of the production of that makeup effect, but a moment of an accident when the mask wouldn't come off the actress's skin, right? And I speculate why that may have happened. If you don't clean a latex mask properly, it can get stuck. It might be the sweat that is produced from the heat of the lamps or the humidity of Bombay. And it's possible that it was filmed as it was getting stuck, right? And so much of the pain and the bodily torture that you then see on screen is also an index of the kind of historical materiality of production, right? So let's say an atmospheric materiality of the production of the film is palpable as body horror, right? And so by the end of the book, I felt like horror was not just my object, but a method of knowing or not knowing something about the films in the period.
So we have about 12 minutes left. So we have a few questions. So I'm going to turn to that. First, I'm putting into the chat a discount code offered by UC Press. And Kartik, was it 15%? Do you know what the discount was?
I don't want to speak out of turn, but since it says event 40, I'm guessing.
So it's a good opportunity for those of you whose interest has been piqued by this discussion. Take the code. So we have a question in from Karen Redrobe. What advice do you have for first-time book authors in the wake of having completed this fabulous publication?
That's a big question. What advice do I have to... Again, I'll just say that, and Bruno and I have talked about this in other ways. I think for a long time while I was working on the project, I felt convinced that I was failing to do the right project. Because my archival research wasn't paying off, my fieldwork wasn't paying off, like I wasn't able to enter the palace where they filmed, I wasn't able to get my hands on a court file that I thought would answer everything. I felt like there was something about me that was failing to do the right kind of project. And the more comfortable I got sitting inside those failures and recognizing the broader matrix within which those failures is happening, right, made me lean harder on the films to produce what I now think is my most kind of original contribution, right, which is using the films to read for traces of history. And that wouldn't have happened if I had just refused to acknowledge the limits of my own method, right? And so maybe my advice is it's okay to fail and use that as a prompt to know differently or try something else.
Great. Okay, another question has come in from Ruby Rich. As you probably know, Canadian filmmaker Atom Magoyan made a film, The Adjuster, 1991, in which his wife, Arsene Kanjian, plays a character who works as a censor and is fascinated by the scenes she cuts. You probably know the film, but it makes me wonder, how do you see horror and censorship in India and the period you're discussing as unique to India? And are there any correspondences with other horror films or other censorship practices elsewhere?
Hi, Ruby. Thank you for the question. I actually haven't seen the film, so that's a great suggestion, and I will check it out. I am familiar with horror films, unsurprisingly, in which some kind of censor is at work looking at horror film images, including the film called Censor, C-E-N-S-O-R. I see the horror and censorship in India, it's certainly different than the primary context in which horror film censorship has been studied, right? So horror film censorship has often been studied in the context of the code and its administration in Hollywood. And one of the things I work on in the book is the difference between script approval, which was front-loaded in the era of the production code administration, because it was run by a body that was friendly with the industry and was interested in getting films to circulate, worked very differently than the kind of censorship that happens when a finished film is submitted to the censor, right? And so in some ways, the kinds of damage and traces of history that are so rich for me, I feel could only exist in a context of that kind of collision between a finished film and a new censoring authority. I spent some time in chapter 1 looking at the relations between the film The Bride of Frankenstein, which is a kind of 30s horror film that was censored by the PCA, and one of the directives was to remove excessive images of kind of strangulation, right? And so the filmmaker replaced those images with the images of an owl looking on as the violence is happening. And in Darwaza, which is the 78 film, paying homage to that sequence from The Bride of Frankenstein with shots of an owl looking on, right? And so that homage to me inscribes not only this transnational love that we call genre, but also a whole history of censorship then gets recapitulated through the homage. And so the censor is also present in this generic formation we call horror.
Great. Okay, so we have a question from Ushair. Thanks for a great conversation about a fabulous book. Kartik, now that you're done with this book, what continues to haunt you about horror as a genre and as a method? Also, what exciting work remains to be done on Indian horror?
Hi, Usha. Thanks for that question and for championing the book as it was being written. So yes, the book is done. I'm so grateful that it has materialized and it's completely outside of me. I think horror as a method is something that I had to come to very slowly. It was much more obvious to me that horror was my object. But it was once I became comfortable with the idea that not everything can be known, that it became possible for me to write the introduction that I did, which is that, you know, images are very rich. They can be read as indices of history, but they cannot answer all the questions you ask of them. And in fact, the more questions that you ask of an image, the more haunted or more reticent the image comes to seem, right? And in fact, so this kind of reading the image as archive is producing an excess of unknowability as much as of information, right? And I found it very useful to think with Erin Wang's work here on post-socialist horror. One of the things she says is, if we stop thinking of horror in the ways we normally do, which is a kind of fairly well-known iconography of monstrosity associated with American, Western European film industries, horror comes into view for her as a mode of comprehension or incomprehension that arises when an external event exceeds one's internal frame of comprehension. And she's speaking of a very different context, but I found it useful because that mode of encounter that she's describing is something that was very much at work whenever I was looking at this film. And so to me, horror as a method is doing something quite different than horror as an object, even though they're both tangling with a kind of unknowability. Horror as a method allows me to sit with the kind of both the desire to know, but also the limits of what can be known from the image. I know there's a lot more, but we can get to it when we...
Well, and we have a few more questions. So this next one is from Debashri Mukherjee. I love your route into materiality of the image through a focus on labor of various bodies on and off screen. Would you say Seeing Things is a media industries or production studies book? This is mainly a question to think about the relation between studies of production and studies of genre and aesthetics.
Hi, Debashri. Thanks for the question. I think the book is partly contributing to our understanding of production. I think a lot of the work on in production studies has used other methods to document and let's say track the work that goes into the making of images. One of the contributions that I'm trying to make here is to read the image as the site of the inscription of that label, right? And so what becomes apparent if you look at, let's say, distracted extras in the background of a scene of horror who are refusing to be horrified by whatever is happening within the frame, right? And I'm thinking maybe of your own work here on exhaustion and the ways in which exhaustion then is a kind of structural force within popular film industries, these kinds of lulls of waiting, right? But what I found useful to think about the extra was how routinized the work of being extra to the scene was producing a kind of indifference to the demands of generic performance. So in this case, yes, the woman, they're playing nurses while a woman is being killed by a curse, but earlier that day, they might have been playing nurses to a regular childbirth. And so there's a kind of confusion here about the demands of generic performance across different films that's producing a kind of glitch or failure to become horror that I found really useful. And so there's something that opens up about are ways of thinking with the affectivity of production labor through the image that may not be available through other means.
Right. Okay, next from Iggy Cortez. I was wondering if you could talk about the connections that exist between the extreme materialities and embodiments in this book and your other interests in the more elusive or imperceptible materialities of digital filmmaking and special effects.
Hi, Iggy. Thanks for that question. That's a perfect segue into new work. So one of the things that, as I was wrapping up the book, but I was also aware of as I was writing the book, is that this is a book about the 80s, which many of us collectively understand as that last gasp of physical materiality, right? And so there's something nostalgic about writing about physical props, physical locations, the physical film, right? In an age that's entirely understood to be immaterial. And maybe as a way to both guard against that nostalgic way of writing, but also because thinking materially becomes a habit that doesn't go away. My new work is focused on moments of glitch or failure in big budget global blockbusters. And so I'm interested there in thinking with how moments, let's say, of digital glitch, fuzziness in what are otherwise sharply delineated images can serve as traces for a different kind of understanding of production labor that's implicated when VFX studios that are distributed around the world have to come together to produce a single image, right? And so when I was talking about body genres and Bombay horror as the kind of the palpability of the film set within the frame, here you're getting a very different sense of a disaggregated post-production pipeline, all converging within the same frame. And so some of the work that I've recently worked on is looking at, let's say, digitally generated dust and the seams in digital plates within the same image, let's say in RRR, as the trace of the work of many, many different VFX studios. About 20 VFX studios worked on that film. And as the image is getting passed around and handed over, these seams emerge within the image that allow us to feel a different kind of crowd that's off screen, but not palpable.
Well, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get to all the questions. Sorry, Netta, thank you for that question. But it's wonderful to have such an engaged audience and such a fantastic, lively conversation. Many thanks to you, Kartik, for presenting your work with us, and Bruno, as always, for your excellent interlocutor skills. So thank you, everyone, for coming. This will be up on our website in about a week's time, and look out for our next one sometime in June. So bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.